This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone, since our parents had gone to a Halloween party. They had tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This bummed my brother and I out, because we had plans to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to still be trick-or-treating, and that we could instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invite to come over, because they still wanted to go trick-or-treating, so that left me home alone with my little brother handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10 p.m., almost all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch watching a scary movie, stuffing ourselves with candy, when there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who the hell could be knocking at our door this late. I assumed that it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters. Even if that was the case, I had turned the porch light and Halloween decorations off, which had been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy or that we weren't home. So I assumed it was my parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole and saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face I could spot was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way that this guy was a trick-or-treater, because he wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There's no way in hell I was gonna open the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door and was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted to him. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you alone in there?" the man asked, almost in a mocking voice. His voice was raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping his cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pockets, and he was still shaking a bit. I began to wonder if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could. "Get the fuck away from my house or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded, and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably some homeless crackhead. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw him completely off of our property. My brother and I were breathing a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. My brother and I were a bit paranoid after this and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell him about the man, since he hadn't really tried to harm us. Now when I think back to this, I wish we had called the police, because maybe we could have been able to prevent a murder. You see, the next day we found out that the elderly woman who lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbor had found her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from the information we had given them, since we hadn't seen many details of his face. They went on the hunt for the man, but never caught him. I blame myself for that poor old lady's murder, because I could have prevented it from happening just by calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all is the fact that he didn't take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched, but he could have gone in and taken what he wanted since the door was wide open. This means that he just wanted to kill. That was his only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry. He only had the urge to murder. This took place a while ago. I was 13 and my family had just moved to a new town. A new friend of mine from school and I made plans to go trick-or-treating together. At the time I remember thinking I was a bit too old to still be trick-or-treating, But who doesn't want free candy? My friend and I figured we still had 1 year of trick-or-treating left in us. Because we were 13 and lived in a fairly safe neighborhood, my parents thought it was fine for us to go trick-or-treating together without adult supervision. Everything was going great and we were having fun. Then we rang on one guy's doorbell. The porch light was on and there was a pumpkin or two, so we figured the people in the house were likely to be handing out candy. A middle-aged man opened the door. At first I was glad because he was dressed in a costume and happy to see my friend and me, so I felt we were in for some top-tier candy. I don't even remember what candy he handed out, but I do remember what happened next. He asked us to enter his home, which is weird, but we were 13, so we didn't really think anything of it. Then he asked if he could take our photo. He said he always liked to take photos of the kids every Halloween because he loved seeing the costumes. On one of his walls were a bunch of pictures of different random unrelated children in Halloween costumes. At this point, even being a dumb 13-year-old, I was starting to get kinda creeped out, but I figured it was best not to upset the man and let him take the picture and then we could leave. So he snaps a photo of us, and then he pulls out a clipboard with a sheet of paper on it with a bunch of names written in childish handwriting. He says he likes the kids whose pics he snaps to sign their names so he knows who they are. At this point, we were both mega creeped out. We should have just run away, but we were too conditioned not to be rude. I decided to sign a fake name. He looked at the paper, looked back up at me, then down at the paper. Then he repeated the fake name that I gave him and nodded. Luckily, after that, he didn't do anything, and we were free to leave, but it definitely creeped us both out. At the time, I thought he was just an eccentric guy, but as an adult looking back on the story, it seemed much more sinister. I'm so glad nothing bad happened to us, and hope nothing bad happened to any other kids. Halloween is my favorite holiday. Is, not was, despite the events that unfolded one crisp Halloween Eve when I was about 16. At the time I lived with my parents, younger brother, older stepbrother, and cousin in a big but old house that sat in a cul-de-sac close to the main street. Behind it ran an alleyway flanked by apartments, and it had a huge yard that my basement bedroom looked out on. We lived in a small town. Crime seemed minimal in the area, and I'd make my way out of that Halloween night to make the most of the best day of the year. It wasn't just what happened that night though. It was, of course, what came after, and one small incident that came before. A few days before Halloween, my stepbrother and cousin arrived home to discover a pickup truck full of dudes taking photos of our house. Weird, but once we approached them, the men seemed friendly and complimented our Halloween setup. It was pretty great, that is true. The men sped off without incident and were quickly forgotten. My stepbrother and cousin re-entered the story Halloween night, the big event itself, at about 3 a.m. Both had been out drinking with their friends, and as such, both had left their respective vehicles and braved the icy walk on their own. Cousin arrived home first, but couldn't seem to get his key in the lock, so just sat on the porch bench and waited for my stepbrother to show up. He did, about half an hour later. After having a bit of a laugh at my cousin for being an uncoordinated goober, he went to unlock the door himself, and no luck. So they bit the bullet and called my mom, waking her up to let them in. She was, of course, unimpressed to be opening the door for a pair of drunk idiots at this time of night, and didn't buy their story about the wonky lock. They insisted, though, and to shut them up, she finally relented and tried her key. She too could not get her key in the lock. Annoyed, tired, and not just confused, she wrote it off as a problem for tomorrow, and the three of them hit their respective hay. One other person arrived home late that night. Me. Though I arrived much earlier than those two, and was in bed by about midnight. I woke up close to 1 a.m., still tired. All I could feel was anxiety, and I didn't know why. At first I tried to tell myself that I had just gotten a bit too into the holiday spirit and had psyched myself out, but then I noticed a shadow. It was perfectly man-shaped and cast upon my window. I turned on my bedside lamp, blinked, and it was gone. It wasn't unusual, mind you, to see the shadows of people harmlessly walking through the alley, and I told myself that's all there was to it. Then there was what happened after. I came home from school the next day. My parents were there, so was the locksmith, and so were the police. My parents were there because, well, that's where they lived. The locksmith was there because my mother had called him as the confusion over the broken lock persisted. The cops were there because the locksmith and my parents had called them when the locksmith proceeded to pull the tip of a knife out of our lock. I was relieved to see that's where the knife tip had ended up, though, as they discovered 2 of our window screens had been slashed. One on our garage and one on my bedroom window.